Today we are talking with David Biello, the author of The Unnatural World, The Race to Remake Civilization in Earth's Newest Age. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit more about what the book is all about and how did you end up writing this book?
So The Unnatural World is about the pervasive and permanent impacts that people are having on the planet. So much so that some scientists are calling this a new geologic time period, a new geologic epoch. They've called it the Anthropocene. I don't particularly like that word, so we changed it up to the Unnatural World, but it's really kind of traveling around the globe and seeing all the different ways in which people are changing the planet. That's from the bottom of the ocean all the way up to the top of the sky and beyond, even into space. So that's what the book is about. And, I make the argument that, yes, indeed, we are in an Anthropocene. And since we ought to do something about it and offer some ideas for what that might be. The reason I wrote the book is because I've been a journalist for a very long time. And I've been writing about kind of the science of the environment, a lot of the different challenges that humanity is facing, from energy poverty to climate change, to the extinction of animals and plants and other species, but nothing that really tied them all together. And it felt to me that perhaps this concept of the Anthropocene, of a new geologic epoch, might be a lens through which we could kind of look at all these problems together. Because one of the unfortunate realities is that we're not going to be able to solve these problems in isolation. If you try to solve climate change, you may end up exacerbating some other environmental problem, and vice versa. A great example of that is making auto fuel from corn, corn ethanol. So a kind of more holistic look is what I'm arguing for, and that's why I wrote the book.
Oh, okay, wonderful. What is so unnatural about it? I mean, human beings have come to dominate the food chain, and we tend to rule the earth, even though the earth is, or our planet is made up of 70% ocean and 30% landmass. But what is so unnatural about it, and how, and why it has become so much of an issue now than it was 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 years ago?
That's a great question and really gets to the core of the book. I actually argue, so the title is a bit of a head fake, if you will. I actually argue that there's nothing unnatural about humanity. We're just as much a part of nature as anything else on this planet, and what we do is kind of inherently natural. So that's a bit of a false division. But the reality is that humans have become so predominant on the planet, so powerful in our impacts, whether it's changing the composition of the air that we all breathe, or acidifying the oceans, you name it. You name kind of an Earth system, and we're changing it. Now, we're not the first organism to transform the planet. As in all things, cyanobacteria actually got there first. Microbes got there first. The great oxidation event, the great oxygen event, where they actually put oxygen in the sky and kind of paved the way for us many billions of years later. Also, when plants first evolved, that was a big step change in Earth's history, but we're the first to do it with the possibility of being conscious about it. And so I wrote the book to try to call attention to that fact so we could be a little bit more conscious about it, as there are, 7 billion plus of us and growing, trying to do all the things that we're trying to do to have a better life, but also perhaps saving a little room for our fellow travelers on this planet as we pursue those goals.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you wrote very well in the book that humanity is writing new chapter in Earth's history, in the rocks, in the chemistry of oceans, composition of air, and the evolution of life. Give us some examples of what we're doing that, as you say, is very deep and pervasive that we may not realize on the rocks, or in the oceans, or in the air.
Yeah, so I'll start with the last one because that's the one that most folks are probably most familiar with. Obviously, we're putting a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's not unusual. We breathe it out every day, but that's not the source of the problem here. We are digging up kind of fossilized sunshine, coal, oil, natural gas, and burning it. And as a result, we have changed the composition of the atmosphere so that the air holds, instead of 0.03% CO2, we're now up to about 0.04% CO2. That doesn't sound like a huge change, but actually, if you look back in geologic history, it turns out that that's been enough to kind of bring ice ages to a close and things of that nature. And those are the kinds of massive changes that geologists have used to kind of date different periods in Earth's history. One of the other ways they date these periods in Earth's history that you mentioned is through extinction events. And unfortunately, we are currently producing one of those. So, for example, the most famous extinction event, obviously, is when the asteroid slammed into the Earth and kind of brought the reign of the dinosaurs to a close. On one side of that divide, there are dinosaur skeletons. On the other, there aren't so many, although, of course, the birds are still with us, the dinosaurs' latter-day descendants. We are producing something similar. There are very few large animal species left on the planet, and that will be very apparent in the rock record, in the fossil record. What will also be apparent is that for some strange reason, cats, chickens, cows, these animals that we've kind of favored as a result of our agriculture or kind of our home life, in the case of pets, have proliferated, have filled the gap left by these missing animals. So that will also be apparent in the rock record. And then, we are changing the very rocks themselves. So people have built dams that hold silt back. Sedimentation is one of the ways you end up with sedimentary rocks, where geologists of the far future, if they look, will be able to see, how we change those sedimentation patterns, how we change the courses of rivers, and how we did things like create plutonium where there was none before. Prior to nuclear weapons testing, there was no plutonium on planet Earth. And since 1950, we've had it, and it's going to be with us for hundreds of thousands of years. So those are the kinds of big, profound changes, long-lasting changes that people are inflicting on the planet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The agriculture, the cities, and the sprawl is also carrying out, as you mentioned, in the last few decades alone. We have kind of killed or made extinct some of the largest number of species. That's
right. And also, we are kind of taking charge of evolution in a new way with new technologies. So, biologists have been busily working and have discovered these techniques by which they can kind of alter the genetic code of living creatures. This has caused some folks to be nervous about things like genetically modified crops, but it's also given us the power to potentially resurrect some extinct species like the passenger pigeon or the woolly mammoth, or to save some of the species that are kind of in dire straits right now. A great example of that is the black-footed ferret here in the United States was down to just 8 individuals a couple decades ago. It has rebounded slightly, but as you would imagine, it's kind of just 8 humans were left. There's not a lot of genetic diversity in this particular population of black-footed ferrets. So by using some of the techniques, genetic modification, you can take genes from samples of black-footed ferrets that were stored in museums or other places and re-inject some of that genetic diversity back into the living population and hopefully, help them thrive in this new, what I'm calling, unnatural world.
I think the title also holds Race to Remake Civilization, and of course, it's a very broad phrase, and of course different people see it in a different way. But where do you see the race? What are we remaking, or how we are remaking, and where this race has taken us in the last 50, 70 years?
Well, so the race is to build I hate to use a buzzword, but a sustainable civilization, a civilization that isn't kind of wreaking more havoc than the goods it's delivering. We want to have, kind of economic and social wealth for people, while also kind of preserving the opportunity for these other plants and animals and other living things to thrive on this planet along with us. Right now, we're in the last, 150 years, we have kind of accelerated in our ability to impact the other species on the planet. That's thanks to the exploitation of fossil fuels, among other things. That has also allowed our population, obviously, to boom. And as a result of that booming population, we need more agriculture, we need more fossil fuels, we need more of all these things. And that has accelerated our impacts, like the carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, and you name it. But there are efforts to not just proceed differently, and that's the race to remake civilization, but also to ameliorate some of our worst impacts. So perhaps reversing extinction, as I just mentioned, or perhaps pulling carbon dioxide back out of the sky to kind of set a more favorable climate. And the reason it's a race is because ultimately, we talk about saving the planet, but it's not the planet we're trying to save, it's us. The planet will be fine one way or the other. No matter what we do, the planet will still be here. What might not be here is us. And so that's why I say it's a race to remake civilization before catastrophic climate change, kind of drowns our most populous cities, or we kill so many species that we can't kind of support ourselves agriculturally, or we acidify the oceans to the point where we basically change the character of the planet itself, so it's a little bit hostile to humanity, or more hostile to humanity than it has been. And those are the things we're trying to avoid. And it's kind of like we're in the adolescence of our species. We've come to realize that we have this great power, but we haven't realized that we have this great responsibility as well. And that's where the real struggle comes. It's not a problem of technology or anything else. It's a problem in us, in our human nature and the way we think about things. That's where the real struggle is over this unnatural world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the book you raise this issue very well, which is environmentalist paradox. If the earth is going to hell, then why are so many people benefiting? We have a largest middle class enjoying really good living standards compared to 100 or 1,000 years ago. And yet we worry about that, this whole thing can collapse and we can be completely washed out. So
that's right. Yeah.
And the paradox, if you want to go a little bit deeper into that, and so people can understand that what we are doing or what we think we're doing is good may not be enough.
That's right. And we want that to continue, right? It would be a shame if people, there are still 2 billion people around the world who are cutting short their lives by relying on wood or dung to cook their food or heat their homes, and therefore breathing in the soot that then makes them sick or gives their children asthma or exacerbates tuberculosis. These are folks who deserve modern energy and a more modern lifestyle. And we're not going to be able to provide that without some pretty significant changes in the way we go about producing energy. Fossil fuels are great, and they have allowed the creation of that large middle class that you mentioned, and obviously a large kind of plutocracy above that, and an even larger group of people who are still mired in poverty. So fossil fuels have gotten us to that kind of large middle class. And the hope is to extend that to more people, but in a way that does not completely destroy the foundation on which human civilization and all its diversity, right? It's not like Americans are like Indians or like Chinese or like Nepalis or like Russians, you name it. That we have this incredible diversity of cultures, but we're all engaged in this kind of one project of sustaining human civilization, and the foundation on which human civilization rests are these Earth systems. We need the weather to not be too crazy. We need soil to be able to grow our crops. We need the ocean to provide, the fish that so many rely on for protein. And we mess with those systems at our peril. That's exactly what we're doing right now. We need to get a handle on those things in a much more realistic way than we have been doing to date. And of course, it's ridiculous, as I kind of alluded to there, to talk about we as if there was a we for all of humanity. My lived experience is very different from yours, or from somebody living in the Gambia, or from somebody living in Chile. There's an incredible diversity of people, an incredible diversity of kind of access to everything, an incredible diversity of responsibility. That's both a strength, and in that we'll have many more options, many more solutions available. That's the creativity of humanity. But it's also a weakness in that it becomes more difficult to decide that, and more difficult to restrain some of our worst impacts, because they may be embedded in a culture, or I may be attached to my job as a coal miner, or you name it. And that's the real battle, is this kind of battle within human nature itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are there any forces at play that help us to come together and then kind of create a unified, or at least some kind of common vision? And as you mentioned very well in the book, actually, at some point, that we all suffer from the collective social amnesia, and that allows this continued decline. Then somehow we can, if we can educate ourselves together, we can stop that decline that we are all part of.
That's right. This is that idea that the scientists call shifting baseline. If you've never seen a woolly mammoth in the wild, then it's perfectly normal for you to think that the world should not have woolly mammoths. Of course, that's kind of an absurd example, because they haven't been around for 4,000 odd years. But basically, in each human lifetime, there is a kind of subtle degradation. And the elders among us may pick that up, because in their youth, the fish were bigger, or the forests were more robust, or you name it. Things were better in the good old days. But the youth have never seen any difference. And so they think that a reef without giant grouper is normal, when in fact it's not. And we live in this world that's kind of haunted by ghosts, these animals that were once there and are no longer. And sometimes the plants are still there that were fed on only by this particular animal that's now missing. We have these kind of relic species. And so recognizing that and working to overcome that, I think, is one way we can come together to create a more sustainable world, to realize that, it might be good to have some giant groupers back on the reef, so they can perform their function in the ecosystem, or who knows, maybe that fanciful dream can come true. Maybe we can bring woolly mammoths back to Siberia, because they perform some important function there.
Give us some examples of how our ocean is being affected by us, of what we do, and how it could come back and haunt us 1,000 years or 5,000 years from now.
Yeah, I think this planet would be called Ocean if there was a fair and impartial judge doing the naming, given that the oceans cover about 70% of the globe. But of course, human beings, us, we are land animals, so of course we named it Earth instead. But the oceans are a difficult place for us to study, because we are land animals, and in fact we have a better sense of the surface of the moon, or even the surface of Mars, than we do of the bottom of the ocean of our own planet. And the ocean, being this kind of large expanse that dominates the globe, kind of drives most of the Earth processes. So most of the heat that we have trapped with our kind of extra CO2 has been dumped into the ocean. Actually, most of the extra CO2 hasn't ended up in the sky and in the air we all breathe. It has ended up in the ocean, and it's rendering it more acidic. Those two changes alone, kind of a hotter, more acidic ocean, are changing this massive global system. The life within the ocean is having to adapt to new conditions. The coral reefs that so many rely on to kind of generate the fish that we then eat are being bleached or dissolved by these hot and more acidic conditions. We are changing the nature of the most kind of fundamental system of the planet, and we're doing it in ignorance because, like I said, we don't have a good sense of even what's out there in the ocean. We don't have good surveys of, there are still mysteries in the ocean. We can see a giant squid for the first time in recent years. We can still discover new microbes in the ocean. And most worryingly of all, we can still discover new organisms that provide the oxygen that, of course, we rely on to live, and also, by the way, to burn our fossil fuels. That oxygen, there's a tiny little single-celled organism in the ocean that no one discovered until the 1980s, basically because our sieves, what we were sampling the ocean with, were too big. These creatures were too small to be captured by that means. And once we got a finer grained sieve, we discovered them, and we realized that a significant percentage of the oxygen we all breathe is coming out of these tiny, tiny, tiny organisms in the ocean. And if they're struggling with those hotter, more acidic conditions, we're putting in peril our very life support system. Not to scare you too much, but that is the one the damage to the ocean is probably the one that we think about the least and is the most worrying, frankly, because we know how to fix things on land. We have a very dim sense of what's going on in the oceans and how to fix it.
Yeah, if you don't even know what we have, and I think humans don't even have the scope of cannot even understand the scope of what we have in the ocean, and as a result, we just are very, in many ways, ignorant of what is out there.
That's right, and therefore kind of blasé about it, and don't worry about it. You can live in a coastal city like I do, New York City, and forget the ocean is even there until suddenly there's a hurricane and the ocean is at your front door, and then you remember it.
In the third part of the book, A Better Anthropocene, you deal with the city folks and the final frontier, and give us a little bit overview of what is that we can do that could be a better way to deal with all these things.
So yeah, that's where I shift to kind of looking to the future and what we might do to not only build a sustainable civilization, but one that can undo some of the things that we have done. A kind of we've been unintentionally engineering this geologic change to date. So what would it be like if we were intentionally doing something about this new geologic age, a kind of intentional Anthropocene? So one idea is that, we could concentrate on technologies to, as I said, pull carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, because we've already probably put too much out there for temperatures to remain comfortable for us. Now that could be everything from farming the oceans. That's something we haven't tried too much, except in the case of salmon. We could be farming some of those organisms that I mentioned that are producing oxygen. They also happen to pull CO2 out of the sky, and if you bury them at sea, then that CO2 gets buried far away. And that's one of the natural ways that Earth has dealt with excess CO2 in the past. Of course, these tiny single-celled organisms aren't the only technology that can pull CO2 out of the sky. We have these things called plants. I'm sure you've heard of them. It's everything from our crops to the trees. And obviously, we could soup up photosynthesis with some of those genetic modification techniques that I talked about. But then there are the more hard-edged solutions that we could try. One of the other main ways that the Earth naturally deals with too much CO2 is this process called weathering. Volcanic rock, basalt, and other types actually pulls CO2 out of the sky too. It just does it very, very slowly, on the order of hundreds of thousands or millions of years. It can drop CO2 levels back to a more comfortable climate range. Of course, we don't have hundreds of thousands or millions of years in which to build a more stable civilization. So one idea is to kind of expose more of the volcanic rock to CO2, the benefit of which is the CO2 actually gets turned into rock, which means it's incredibly stable. So it's kind of buried forever for all intents and purposes and locked away from the atmosphere where we've been dumping it. And then if all else fails, there's humanity's oldest trick, which is technology. We could build plastic trees and other machines that could actually suck CO2 out of the sky too. So there are a number of ways in which we could address this climate change problem. It's a matter of kind of the will to do so. And that's why I keep coming back to this idea that the problem is not technology, the problem is not the planet, the problem is us and kind of our decisions and what we want to do. And right now, by kind of being unintentional and unconscious about our negative impacts, we're hurting ourselves, and hopefully we can wise up to that and build kind of a better Anthropocene, a more long-lasting Anthropocene, and then we might qualify for an even longer geologic time period, and we might call it the Anthropozoic or something like that.
Fascinating. We've been speaking with David Biello, the author of The Unnatural World, The Race to Remake Civilization in Earth's Newest Age. So much about the book. Give us a little background about you and how did you end up in the field of energy and environment. You have a long history of working there and writing there as well. How did you get interested in the field?
That's a great question. I don't know that I can kind of pinpoint one thing or another that that first got me interested in the field. I've always been kind of drawn to nature. Spent my childhood mucking about in the backyard and in the front yard. We actually, one of the I guess foundational experiences for me was realizing that something that I thought of as very natural. We had this creek kind of running through our front yard, and it would flood, and had animals living in it, frogs, fish, you name it. And it turns out that creek was almost entirely fed by highway runoff. So what seemed to me this an incredible, natural thing was, by some lights anyway, an incredibly unnatural thing. So that perhaps put me in the frame of mind to write this particular book. But anyway, I grew up and became a journalist because I wanted to tell, true stories about the world. And the stories that I was most drawn to were kind of people trying to make the world a better place, particularly addressing environmental issues, whatever those might be. And so I have spent I've spent since the latter part of the 20th century, if you will, documenting some of those stories, and wanted to try to pull together some of the things that I'd learned and look at it in this more holistic way I described. And so this idea of the Anthropocene I became aware of and thought that was the way to maybe approach a book addressing all these issues.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You're currently editing at Scientific American and also hosting an award-winning documentary, Beyond the Light Switch, for PBS as well.
That's right. I've been lucky. I was a writer and editor for Scientific American on staff for about 10 years. I'm a contributing editor now, so we'll continue writing for them. Scientific American is a great place to explore the science of a lot of these questions. And I've also been lucky enough to be involved in some television journalism as well. It's a little bit unusual for me. I am more comfortable working in writing, I think, because you can kind of observe and interact at your own pace, whereas in television you kind of got to be right up there in front with the camera, interacting with people or the environment or whatever it might be. But it's been an incredible journey, and the latest and greatest is this book, which I'm pretty proud of, and I hope people will enjoy.
Oh, I'm sure. It's a fascinating book that is so well written. Are you exploring other topics as well that may turn into books 2, 3 years from now, or?
I am still recovering from kind of the shock of writing this book, so I can't say that I have. Yeah, can't say that I have. My next book all lined up, but I have started working with TED, as in TED Talks, as well, and just been exposed to so many fascinating people and ideas that I'm sure sooner or later I will recover from the shock of this book and come up with another one.
Thank you very much for your time and your comments.
Thank you.